You know that structuralism is a vast subject, and structuralism is part of the syllabus of MA second semester and also of MA fourth semester. But since there are many other aspects of theory in both papers, but structuralism is common. So I thought that maybe I can have a kind of combined class where I talk about structuralism. And I have already discussed structuralism maybe in 3-4 lectures in the classroom in room number 4, which I have with the MA 4 semester students. But since structuralism has not, the discussion of structuralism has not started in MA second semester, so I'm starting from a scratch. And of course, my assumption is that if I have problem following something, if I have to read something many times, then obviously these extra lectures which you are attending, they won't hurt you. And many of you actually did not attend those lectures. So that is also one reason where now you can make use of this opportunity. So we are going to talk about structuralism, right? In our usual class, I would have asked you first to articulate yourself, but here we are making use of the available time. So what we say that structuralism was a movement in literature and language which had its very important presence in 1960s, right? But as it happens in any movement, in any intellectual movement, you have some precursors. Precursors means many of those theories, many of those books which talk about something, the full ramifications of which will be realized later. So we begin our discussion of structuralism with one very important book. This was a book by an Italian writer. His name was Vico. That is Giambattista Vico. Vico wrote a book. Its title was The New Science. Interesting. There is always this idea of new in different periods. We have the idea of new now in 21st century, and Vico had his own idea of new in 18th century. So this book came out in 1725, and what it talked about, and this is very interesting, it talked about physics of man. Physics of man. So you can see that Vico is basically presenting his idea of the physics of man, keeping in mind the work of many philosophers who use reason, who use science to talk about, say, nations. But Vico is talking about physics of man, not physics of nations, not physics of things. He started with one very interesting observation. He started with one very interesting observation. Okay, somebody is raising hand. Let me just see who is raising hand. Somebody is raising hand. No. Do I see anybody raising hand? No. Okay, I can join Chevy in having tea. Right. So what was this idea? He talked about the primitive man. When we say primitive man, please do not think that I am using the word primitive as a kind of synonym for savage. No, we are talking about primitive man. Even in our own times, we have some people who can be considered primitives. Say, for example, people who live in Andaman and Nicobar, many tribes, they are our primitive contemporaries. Primitive contemporaries. They live at the same time as we do, but in their life patterns, in their beliefs, in their cultural pattern, they are very much primitive. So primitive refers to a particular time period, and primitive also refers to a particular attitude to life. You have somebody like D.H. Lawrence, who is called a primitivistic thinker, right? So Vico talked about primitive man, and he is visualizing a time when humanity came into being. He is visualizing a time when humanity came into being, when human institutions came into being, when in a way humanity was created. So what he says, that primitive man possesses a particular kind of wisdom. This wisdom is poetic wisdom. That means if we want to understand the primitive man, we must understand with this notion that he possesses a kind of poetic wisdom. And where do we see the expression of this poetic wisdom? In many of those myths which come to us from times immemorial. Many of those fables which come to us from different generations, all through different generations. And many of those symbols. So when we say that primitive man is basically a person who possesses poetic wisdom, we are equating primitive man with being a poet. And he articulates himself in the language of poets. And what is the language of poets? Metaphors, symbols, myths. Right. Now, from this important observation, he comes to another important point. If we analyze many of those myths, they may appear a very ludicrous kind of description of the world. They may appear laughable. They may appear to talk about many, say, incredulous things or unbelievable creatures. But actually, those myths are not to be taken literally. So, if we think about some myths, and if we think about some specific myths, like for example, Sphinx, say a particular kind of riddle is presented before a Sphinx, or say what is the role of the song of the siren? It misleads sailors, and if when sailors lose their way, they are often killed. And similarly, a stranger comes before a Sphinx. He is presented with some riddles. If he is not able to answer those riddles or solve those riddles, then he is killed. And similarly, you also have many other stories like, say, Ulysses, Apollo. So in all these stories, you see a narrative element, but actually they are pointing to a particular kind of politics of the time. And what is that? There was the fear of the alien, there was the fear of the stranger, and there was this conflict between the plebeians who tried to take control of a city or things, and then he was defeated by the natives or by the patrician elements. So in all this, there is one particular pattern, and the pattern is there is a stranger and there is, say, somebody who is native. So this pattern becomes important. Now, there is another aspect of these myths. When those myths are seen, they try to impose, they try to present a kind of satisfactory and very graspable shape on the environment and the experience. So, for example, a primitive man has some experience of the world. Now, he uses those myths and fables to give shape to the world. That means those myths and fables are ways of thinking, right? They are ways of thinking. Now, this brings us to one very important principle in Vico's philosophy. And again, I repeat this point, that myths, fables, and all those stories, they provide a kind of shape, satisfactory shape, humanizing shape to the reality that the primitive man experiences, right? Madhi, I can join you. Right. So this means that this graspable reality actually is also coming from human mind. So the human mind is thinking through those fables, through those myths, in order to, say, classify and grasp reality. And then because human mind is thinking. So this is coming straight from human mind. So let me just repeat these ideas. In Vico's philosophy, primitive man is a poet. He is a maker. And when we look at the fables and stories and myths, then those myths have elements of metaphor or elements of poetic language. So the primitive man appears poetic in his response to the world. And then these myths are there because he wants to provide a kind of shape to his world. And obviously this shape is coming from his own mind. This brings us to one very important dictum. Verum factum. Okay, Latin words. V-E-R-U-M, verum, F-A-C-T-U-M, verum factum. That means that which man recognizes as true and which he himself has made, they are the same thing. That means man recognizes something as true and he has also made something. Both things are the same. That means men have created institutions and men have created themselves. Men have created institutions and men have created themselves. This is a very interesting insight. That means when we look at all those institutions in the world, when they were created at the same time as the humanity was created. So that means man made institutions, those institutions made man. Man tried to create humanity, and that humanity created man. So we cannot think about a time when there were those institutions but there was no humanity. Similarly, we cannot think about a time when there was humanity and there were no human institutions. You understand this point? Men have created many of those institutions. What are those institutions? See, for example, family. See, for example, kinship. See, for example, home. See, for example, marriage. These are all important institutions. So men created these institutions. But these institutions created man in their turn. Now, there is a kind of structuring principle involved here. And what is that? Anyone who is born in human society thinks that family is something which is natural, marriage is something which is natural, kinship is something which is natural, say a concept of tribe which is something natural. These are all institutions. But because they have been repeated so often, because they follow certain rites and rituals, so they appear natural, but they are not natural. They are created. They are created. And that's why somebody like PK in the movie PK finds it extremely difficult to make sense of the human world, because human institutions are created by humans and possibly they evolve with those institutions, but somebody who is an alien who possibly cannot make sense of those institutions at all. So these institutions are not natural, they are created. And Vico sees the moment of their creation in the moment of the creation of humanity. So when humanity was created, these institutions were created. When these institutions were created, humanity was created. So there is this structuring principle involved here. Structuring principle. Say something which is made. Now there are certain other things also here which are involved in this belief. That, for example, society or human beings or all human societies, they are not created according to some model which exists before them. That means we think about a time when there was a model of society and human beings came and they followed that model. No. In this respect, structuralism is close to, or it shares some ground with existentialism and with Marxism. And this is one very interesting observation. So what happens in existentialism? Existentialism says that there is, what is that idea about existence and essence? Existence is prior to essence. Existence is prior to essence. That means there is no human nature before existence. There is no human nature before existence. So existentialism is not talking about human nature which can come without human existence. So in that respect, structuralism is also talking about this, that it is talking about the creation of human institutions and through them creation of humanity. And existentialism is also talking about existence which is prior to essence. That means there is no, say, essence as such which can be used to, or which is a kind of model for human society. As far as Marxism is concerned, in Marxism, humanity comes into being because of particular social relations and particular systems. So that means there are some systems of human institutions, some social relations. What is meant by social relations? There are particular social relations, for example, in India, particular social relations in other countries. So human beings are basically result of those social relations. You know that in Marxism, it is very important that society is at the center of things, not individuals. Society creates individuals. Individuals do not create society. And so social relations become important. Social relations also include economic relations. So structuralism shares this ground with Marxism here, that it and existentialism, both these philosophies. So this was the beginning. And what is structuralist in the theory of Vico? Two, three things. One, he is thinking in terms of science. He is thinking in terms of science. He is not thinking in terms of beliefs or faith or some kind of religious ideology. Second, Vico is talking about a particular time period when humanity was created, and at the same time were created human institutions, and they both created each other. So there is this element of structure there, structuring principle involved there. And third important thing, we look at those myths and fables, but we don't look at those myths and fables literally, but rather we see that primitive man is expressing himself in the language of poets, and so he becomes a poet, a maker, right? So man is a maker, primitive man is a maker, primitive man is a maker whose language is akin to that of a poet. So we possibly leave this discussion of Vico here, and from Vico we move to another important name. As I said, that Vico was writing in early 18th century. His book was published in 1725. And structuralism proper, structuralism as a method, structuralism as a philosophy became dominant in 1960s. So we are talking about something which happened many, say, or rather a century or so ago. Then in the work of Jean Piaget, we have certain definitions of structuralism, right? So Jean Piaget, Jean, Jean, and Piaget means Piaget, Piaget. What is important about Jean Piaget's work is the definition of structuralism, or different definitions of structuralism. His book is simply titled Structuralism. It came out in 1968. And what is important is that he discusses structuralism in the field of mathematics. Imagine mathematics, logic, biology, psychology, linguistics, philosophy, and social sciences. Does it ring any bell? He's talking about biology, he's talking about mathematics, he's talking about social sciences, he's talking about philosophy, and that means he's talking about a range of subjects, a range of disciplines. He's talking about structuralism with reference to all these fields. This brings us to another question, or rather it throws some kind of light on another aspect of structuralism. And what is that? That we basically should talk about structuralisms. We should talk about structuralist stances. We can talk about structuralism in the plural. We can talk about structuralist method or structuralist stances across disciplines. And Piaget's book is an example, because he discusses all these subjects from social sciences, subjects from sciences, and of course linguistics or language. So that way Piaget is important. So what is his definition of structuralism? He tries to define structure, a very elusive concept, but he tries to define structure. And he identifies three very important properties, characteristics of structure. What are those three very important properties of structure? First, there is the idea of wholeness. Second, there is the idea of transformation. And third, there is the idea of self-regulation. Wholeness, transformation, self-regulation. Wholeness, transformation, self-regulation. Let us try to talk about each, and let us keep in our mind a subject which is dear to all of us, language. Because in this discussion of structuralism, I'll be talking about structuralism with reference to language and with reference to literature. And in passing, I can also mention that structuralism basically was inspired by the ideas of Ferdinand de Saussure, right, who was writing, say, in the second decade of the 20th century, but whose works became available in English translation only in 1950s. And that's why his influence in the English-speaking world became, say, important in 1960s. So don't be confused by two different dates, when Ferdinand de Saussure was writing and when his work started exerting some kind of influence in the English-speaking world, especially in England and United States of America. So let us come back to those three concepts. Idea of wholeness means that a whole consists of parts. This part is simple, but what is important here is that each part acquires a kind of greater significance, greater importance, because of its relationship to other parts. So maybe there are 10 parts which make a whole, but each part there becomes important because it is related to other parts. It is in terms of its relationship to other parts that this part becomes important. Now I am introducing this key word in structuralist theory. If we can talk about one single word which is the most important word in entire structuralist theory, it is this word: relationship. So we talk about a whole, and we talk about parts consisting of wholes, but all these parts in a whole are not aggregates, but they form a whole, and each part is bigger because of its relationship to other parts. In itself, it probably does not appear as significant. So relationship of parts becomes important in the idea of whole. Very quickly, because we'll explain this point later. Very quickly, let us think about language. Language. So if I say that I'm teaching this class, I'm teaching this class. Now this sentence consists of many syllables, many morphemes, many words, many sounds, right? And it is an example of syntax. But each of these parts probably means nothing in itself. If we simply say that a word, this word class acquires significance, importance, because it is part of this whole I am teaching a class. So we were talking about this concept of structure and the definition of a structure, which is given by Jean Piaget. And I also made this point that Jean Piaget is talking about structuralism with reference to a range of disciplines, a range of fields. So after Jean Piaget, it is proper to say that there are structuralist responses, that there are structuralist stances, that there are structuralisms in the plural. Since we are students of language and literature, we will be talking about structuralism with reference to language and literature. So first important property, and he is talking about three important characteristics, three important properties of structure: the idea of wholeness, the idea of transformation, and the idea of self-regulation. So we'll talk about these ideas with reference to language, and of course we'll talk about these ideas with reference to literature also, but probably later in lectures. Now what is important about this is wholeness. Parts make a whole, but important thing is that each part has a bigger entity, or it is bigger because of its relationship to other parts. So the key word here is part to other parts. The second important aspect of structure is transformation. Transformation. Transformation means that changes take place in a structure. A structure does not remain static, it is dynamic, but structure can take care of these changes. Structure can transform itself. Again, we take an example from language. Nobody knew the meaning of the word tsunami in T.S. Eliot's time. Nobody knew that when we use the word mouse, we are most probably referring to a mouse if when we are sitting before our laptop or computer. That means this is a whole new kind of vocabulary. Nobody knew the meaning of collateral damage in the time of Dryden. So that means always new words are added in English language, always new sounds are added, new structures come into being, new rules of word formation come into being, and language takes care of all those changes, whether they be new sounds, new words, new norms of acceptability of grammar. Language takes care of all these changes. It takes into its fold all these changes. And so language is a structure, and a structure can transform itself. And we see with reference to this example that structure, if language is considered a structure, language can transform itself. It can take into its stride all these changes. And so language used in 19th century could possibly include changes which were taking place at that time, and language in our time is taking care of all those changes which are happening all around us. So the second important thing is the idea of transformation. The third important characteristic is a bit difficult to define, and that is the idea of self-regulation. Let us see the literal meaning of this expression regulation. When something is regulated, And when we say that something is self-regulated, that means it is not, say, any outside agency which is trying to exert control of this, but rather it is doing something on its own because of its own laws, because of its own nature, because of its own inherent principles. And in this case, again, language is. So we started talking about structuralism. We first talked about some precursors of structuralism, because we are talking about one important movement in literature which had its impact in 1960s, 70s, but it had an important precursor in the form of one Italian philosopher whose name was Vico. Vico wrote a book titled The Physics of Man. In that book, he made some very interesting observations. One important observation was that when we look at the primitive man, then primitive man is not a beast or a savage. Rather, he emerges as a kind of poet who articulates himself through the language of poetry. So, if we look at some of those stories, fables, myths, which are the thing that primitive man created, then in those myth, fables, and stories, we see a particular kind of poetic personality at work. So he's thinking through symbols, he's thinking through images, he's thinking through metaphors. There we arrive at one very interesting conclusion, that we are not reading those stories literally, but rather we are reading those stories for their meaning, for the primitive man. And he used those stories to understand his world. That means when we look at those stories and those fables, those myths, then primitive man is trying to grasp reality in a particular form, and he imposes that form to his environment. This means that when we are looking at those stories, we are also looking at the mind which is behind that work. It established an important principle, that was the principle of virum factum. That means what men have created, that is true, and men have created institutions, and those institutions have created men. So men creating institutions and institutions creating men, they are the same, they are the same thing. Now this also means that all these institutions are man-made. So structuralism believes in a scientific view of man, where all those institutions are man-made, and humanity is also created through those institutions. So those institutions create man, and men create those institutions. This was something that we discussed in our last meeting. Then there were other aspects also, and what were those other aspects? At least one important point, and that important point is that all these forms or all these institutions or working of these institutions appear natural, but that is not natural, but rather it is the result of, say, some rites, some rituals, some repeated actions. So there is a kind of structuring principle involved there, where men are creating institutions, those institutions are creating men. Human society is not made after some model, but rather it is something which comes into being in this world. So here it is close to the existentialist idea, where existence is prior to essence. And similarly, say Marxist idea also, where in Marxism also, say, humanity is man-made, a result of social relations. After that, we discussed the work of Jean Piaget, and especially Jean Piaget's concept of structure, because Jean Piaget is important for two reasons. One, for his definition of structure, and second, for the range of fields that he covered in his study, which throws an important insight that structuralism is not simply confined to literature. Structuralism has its implications for all possible fields, sciences, social sciences, and humanities, everything. And so we can talk about structuralisms rather than structuralism. We can talk about structuralist stances, structuralist attitudes rather than simply structuralism in the singular. The definition of structuralism, we saw that for Jean Piaget, there are three important properties of structure. Three important properties. One important property of structure is that it is informed by the idea of wholeness. That means the idea of wholeness. Second, the idea of transformation. And quickly I'll explain that wholeness means that a whole consists of parts. But each part here is important because of its relationship to other parts. And so relationship becomes a very important word, very important term, a very important slogan in structuralist theory. Relationship, relationship, relationship. Second important thing was we talked about the idea of transformation. Structure is capable of transforming itself. It is capable of taking into its fold all possible changes. And so if we consider language as structure, then each part in a language, whether it is a syllable, whether it is a word, whether it is say an aspect of grammar, it is a part, but it becomes important only because it is combined with other parts. A noun has no meaning in itself unless a noun is combined with, say, a subject, a verb, or other things. Similarly, the meaning of a particular word, say the color blue, has no meaning in itself unless we try to see blue in terms of other colors. So part has a relationship to other parts, and in that sense we say that each part acquires an entity which is bigger because of its relationship to other parts. And third was the idea of self-regulation, which I was trying to explain in the last session. If say self-regulation means that language, for example, if it is considered an structure, then language is working because of its intrinsic laws, intrinsic rules, not because of any external agency, not because of any outside force, not because of any outside authority. And what happens that when we use language, a particular word is used because of its status as a noun, or because of its status as a verb, or because of its status as an article. So language works by its own intrinsic laws. It is self-regulated. It does not, say, require any outside reality as such for its functioning. The word tree is important, not because there is a tree outside, but also because the word tree can become part of language, because the word tree is also a noun. So language is working or operating or functioning because of its intrinsic laws. So 3 points: idea of wholeness. Each part is bigger because of its relationship to other parts, or important because of its relationship to other parts. Transformation. All changes can be tolerated by structure, and structure is dynamic by nature. Language, for example, so many new words are being added, so many new sounds are being added, so it transforms itself. And third, idea of self-regulation. There are rules in place and language is functioning because of those rules. So self-regulation. So this is how we look at the definition of structuralism. Now if we move ahead, then we see we must talk about some kind of intellectual background where structuralism became an important movement. So let us survey the scene in the first half of the 20th century. You see, there was a particular kind of realization at that time. And what was that realization? That world does not consist of fragments. There was this realization of the fragmentary nature of knowledge. From mid-19th century to say the 20th century, there was one very important development, and that was the development of specialization of knowledge. In other words, fragmentation of knowledge. where knowledge was seen compartmentalized into, say, small rooms, small fields. And we have seen it in our own time also. There was a time when, say, history, pol science, and many other departments, they were just one. But today, if you see, you have department of history, and not only you have departments of history, but you also have certain very specific kinds of histories also. And similarly, if possibly you want to see a dentist, so there are also dentists who specialize in treating, say, one particular kind of tooth rather than, say, your entire set of 32 teeth. So that means specialization was the buzzword, and specialization was also considered important from mid 19th century onwards. There was kind of reaction, and reaction was that probably knowledge has been divided into fragments, and knowledge does not take into view the total picture. And so this realization also that the world does not consist of independently existing objects. So that means there are objects in the world, but they are not independent of each other. They are related to each other. So this realization actually was important, and this realization gave way to structuralism. Another thing was that this whole notion of objectivity of knowledge was questioned. Objective nature of knowledge. Was it possible? If there is a perceiver and there is an object that that perceiver perceives, does he perceive that object without any bias, or there is something of the perceiver in the perceived things also? So this realization that probably we can see something in relation to the perceived object and the perceiver. So here also relationship between the perceiver and the perceived object becomes important. So first important thing was the realization that knowledge has become fragmentary, or say knowledge is divided into fragments, or fragmentary nature of knowledge, and this realization that this fragmentary of knowledge, say, possibly leads to this conclusion that world consists of independently existing objects, while this is not true. World does not consist of independently existing objects. And second important thing, that we must see the value or the significance of something in relationship to other objects. There were many subjects, they were divided into isolated disciplines. And again, structuralism and existentialism. Existentialism talked about, say, an isolated individual. But there was one parallel movement in knowledge which talked about relationships, although from a different vantage point. This was Marxism, right? So Marxism and structuralism, they both talk about relationships. And here we can bring in Christopher Caldwell. Christopher Caldwell was a very important Marxist thinker. And what does Christopher say? What does he do? He talks about a coherent system. That means he also advocates a coherent system where different elements, say, cohere together, and where meaning is seen because of the relationship of different objects, rather than, say, looking at those objects in an isolated manner. And they both are a response. Marxism and structuralism, they both are a response to the kind of modernist despair, modernist alienation, modernist anxiety. You'll find this element in modernist literature, see, alienation, anxiety, despair. So structuralism and Marxism, they both are a response to this. And they both share a scientific viewpoint. This is important. Marxism believes in a society which comes into being because of matter. So in Marxism, and Marxism is considered a materialistic philosophy. Why? Because it considers matter very important. Everything is made of matter. Marxism does not believe in any spiritual order of existence. Marxism does not believe in any idea of afterlife. Marxism does not believe in any reality which is considered transcendental. Marxism is a philosophy of this world, this world, this world. And so is structuralism. Structuralism is also a philosophy of this world, this world, this world. So both talk about a coherent system, both share a scientific viewpoint, both talk about relationships, but of course there are differences. And here I can introduce one observation which say in one of his later books Terry Gilton has made, After Theory, that is the title of the book. He says that all literary theory, and it's a very deep statement. He says that all literary theory, and it's a sweeping remark, but there is a grain of truth in this. All literary theory is a kind of creative agreement or disagreement with Marxism. Very big statement. All literary theory is a creative agreement or disagreement with Marxism. That means it somehow engages some questions which are important in Marxism. It somehow relates to Marxism, either disagrees with Marxism. So you see that postmodernism disagrees with Marxism. New historicism and cultural materialism, they derive their ideas from Marxism. Structuralism also shares some common ground with Marxism. Deconstruction, Derrida himself said that his work could not have been possible without Marxism. So Marxism is everywhere in contemporary literary theory. Either some theorists seek some kind of agreement with Marxism or they disagree with Marxist positions. So structuralism and Marxism, we briefly touched on this relationship. Now another question about structuralism. How do we consider structuralism, as a method or as a movement? That means, do we consider structuralism as a philosophy of mind, or we consider structuralism also a kind of method? Let me make a distinction between the two. If we say structuralism is a movement of mind, then we are basically saying that, just a minute, somebody is trying to connect. I connected but could not be there for long, as I have to conduct my own. Actually, this information is not required anyway. So what we see is that two words, method and movement. Method and movement. When we say a movement of mind, then we are thinking about ways of thinking, ways of approaching an issue. And so far we have talked about structuralism as a movement of mind, where we see the world in terms of relationships, where we search coherent systems, where we possibly look for larger structures, we look for the origin of humanity, we look for the origin of human institutions. In all this discussion, we were looking at structuralism as a movement of mind. But when we discuss structuralism as a method, then we are talking about use of structuralism maybe as a method which we can use to study works of literature, or which we can use to study some other text, whether it is a story, or it is a novel, or it is a poem, or it is a film, or it is a television serial, or it is any other visual or any other kind of text. So structuralism can be a method of inquiry also. Structuralism can be a method of analysis also. Structuralism can be a method of approaching a work also. So see the distinction, structuralism as a movement of mind, which is a far bigger thing, and structuralism as a method which probably has applications, or which probably has some kind of implications for literary works or other works. And we'll see that both are actually considered important. Then again, to continue this discussion, say if we say that structuralism is a movement of mind, in around the same time when there was this idea that world consists of independently existing objects, so at the same time there was a kind of reaction against that stance. Structuralism is one possible reaction against that stance, where it views things in terms of relationships, in terms of larger structures, in terms of a coherent system. There were others also. Say for example, Noam Chomsky's universal grammar also talked about a kind of universal grammar, not simply say an isolated fact, not simply about a word or sentence, but rather its capacity to generate infinite number of structures. So that is also a kind of stance which is against that isolationism or against that fragmented nature of knowledge. Now similarly, in the field of myth, Claude Lévi-Strauss, he was an important anthropologist. Lévi-Strauss also tried to look at myth, and he tried to understand the meaning of a myth in terms of other myths. In terms of other myths, that means he is also viewing things in terms of relationships rather than looking at fragmented nature of knowledge and looking at simply one single myth. Then of course Russian formalism was another important school, and we'll also discuss the relationship between Russian formalism and structuralism, because Russian formalism is also a kind of early structuralism. In Russian formalism, what happens? So the question of literary history becomes important. The rules of literature become important. The laws of literature become important. We'll come back to this point. And there is another very important name whose work is almost contemporary to the work of many of these structuralist critics. He is Northrop Frye. Northrop Frye. So Northrop Frye was a literary critic. You know that Russian formalism, mostly those people who are linguists. Lévi-Strauss was an anthropologist. Chomsky was a linguist. But Northrop Frye was a literary critic, and his work appeared in 1957, and his very powerful work, Anatomy of Criticism. Anatomy of Criticism. It appeared in 1957. In some ways, and I repeat, in some ways, Frye's work is structuralist. Right? In some ways, his work is structuralist. We'll see how his work is structuralist. First of all, Frye, when he appeared on the scene, till that time in United States of America, new criticism was dominant. And what was new criticism interested in? A poem. It was not interested in anything outside that poem. It was not interested in any other questions other than which emerged from that poem. So it was not interested in literary history. It was not interested in history as such. It was not interested in biography. So what appeared here, that literary criticism became a very isolated kind of discipline in its preoccupations with single poems. Frye tried something more ambitious. And what he tried to do, he tried to discover a grammar of literature. This is very important. You see, structuralists will also discover grammar of literature and language. So Frye was also discovering a grammar of literature maybe before structuralists, but of course their orientation is different. So he believed that if we think about literature, then literature can be understood through many modes and through many archetypes and through myths which keep repeating themselves. Very interesting, which keep repeating themselves. So what are some of those modes? He says that there is a mode which is comic mode. There is a mode which is tragic mode. There is a mode which is romantic mode, and there is a mode which is ironic mode. So something can be comic, something can be tragic, something can be romantic, something can be ironic. And all literature can be divided into these modes. And in different periods in history, different modes are dominant. See, for example, when he was writing, at that time, say this ironic mode was probably dominant. A particular mode can make a reappearance later. So here Fry tries to discover this law of literature, that we are talking about different modes and literature flows through those different modes. And usually there also you find a particular kind of conception of a hero. So for example, if we look at a satire or a low comedy, then in that low comedy, the hero is probably inferior to readers. In conception, the hero is inferior to readers. In tragedy and in epic, he is superior to an everyday person in kind. But he is not superior to his environment, and hence tragedy happens. So maybe people like you and me, the hero in that mode of writing, tragedy or epic, is similar to us, maybe better in terms of kind, but he is not superior to his environment, and hence often tragedy happens because he is not able to overcome his environment. A hero is definitely superior in degree to all of us in a myth. So that means you will see this pattern again and again. In tragedy, a particular kind of hero, a particular kind of motive. In tragedy, a particular kind of hero, a particular kind of motive. And this way, literature is expressed through modes. And Fry also tried to relate these four modes to four different seasons. And in a way, what Fry is doing, Fry is discovering a grammar of literature. He is trying to discover some rules of literature. He is trying to discover some laws of literature. In other words, he is also saying that literature is produced out of literature. Literature is produced out of literature, and so it becomes a kind of self-regulated activity. Literature is produced out of literature, maybe without any reference to the outside world. Archetypes also are repeated in literature. Myths are also repeated in literature. So, for example, even a contemporary work, it may be about contemporary times, but it may be structured around a myth. It may be structured around an archetype. And that archetype and that myth provides a kind of framework to that work. Right? So just see one example. All of you are familiar with Mahabharata, and Mahabharata is going to be played on television. If you see Shah Rukh Khan's film Ravan, Ravan also uses the structure of Mahabharata. Ravan also uses the structure of Ramayana in a way that fight between good and evil, which is a very old kind of pattern. So in most works of literature, you can find, say, use of myth which provides a structure, and 20th century writers were very much interested in myth, and you can see use of myth in the works of all 20th century writers. Our session is going to end in a while, so it can go off any minute. So let me just conclude this discussion. So we are saying that Northrop Frye is structuralist in a loose sense of the word, because he is talking about larger structures. He is talking about laws of literature. He is talking about, say, a work in terms of its relationship to other works. He is talking about a particular mode of expression and where different works become important. And literature is produced out of literature. But structuralism proper, which is influenced by the ideas of Ferdinand de Saussure, it has a particular kind of position, a particular kind of doctrine, a particular kind of stance, especially on language. So that stance on language is not there in the work of Northrop Frye. So Frye talks about rules. Structuralism can also talk about many of those larger structures and rules. But structuralism also has a particular stance with reference to language. And that will become clear to us once we discuss Ferdinand de Saussure. But before we discuss Ferdinand de Saussure and structuralism, which is inspired by his ideas, there is another school of criticism which shares a lot of ground with structuralism, and that school is Russian formalism. So we will discuss this relationship also. And lastly, we can also say a word or two about its context. So you see that in the 20th century, basically, in the second half of the 20th century, American society, especially, say universities and other places, businesses, they were gradually becoming very scientific and very managerial. And so was the case with Britain. So they required a particular kind of theory. They required a particular kind of position. And what was that position? Something which goes beyond the isolated nature of knowledge. Something which was there in new criticism. So academy in the United States of America and in Britain required a different kind of critical approach. So structuralism was the answer. So in many respects, it is important because of that context, influence of say Saussure, but also that relationship between Russian formalism and structuralism. And especially there is one strand of structuralism which is called, say, Czech structuralism, which had its seat in Prague. And there one important name, Roman Jakobson, actually unites structuralism in Europe with structuralism in, say, other places. We conclude our discussion at this point.